Today we're going to look at something which I think a lot of people do struggle with, and we're going to be looking at creating custom macros. So last video we created this program which looks at a better way to use buttons. If you want to look at that in a bit more detail, feel free to click the link that's above. I'll also put a link in the description down below, but I think it was quite a useful video and a useful little tutorial. I'm going to adapt this into a program which is going to use some custom macros to do some things in a much tidier way and allow us to do some repeatable effects. So we've used some macros already. These are everything in these orange boxes, these component macros, and these are essentially blocks of code which are used by which somebody else has written, and they make quite complex actions look quite simple in one simple block. And these are really, really useful. These are usually set up for different pieces of hardware that we have. What we can do is we can use this block here, just a normal macro. You can see the difference between the blocks is pretty small, and this has the hatched lines on the side and this has normal lines on the side, and I can quite easily turn that into a component macro if I want to. I can just pop it on like that, and you can see it changes to be a component macro with the hatched edges, which it didn't have before. And to demonstrate what they do, I'm going to do another little small program where we are going to create a timer which just times 2 times in a row. So we'll have a first time that's going to get timed and a second time it's going to get timed. And to start off with that, what I want is I'm going to want to display some stuff on the screen. So I'm going to add some. I'm going to pause the video now. I'm going to add some information in this section of the code here just to set up the screen in the first place, which you don't need to see because it's nice and simple. So now you can see I've got a little bit of code here, which when we press play, it puts some information straight on the screen. And it's not going to quite work quite rightly yet, but when I press a button, it'll start timing. You can see it starts timing in the middle of this screen here, which isn't quite what we want, but we can fix that in just a moment. If we stop and then start again, it's going to keep doing it here. That's not quite what we want to start with. What I can do is I make sure this prints over the start of this section here. So all we need to do is make sure it's printing at the x coordinate 0. And now it'll time quite nicely. So when we press the button, we can see here it's timing in normal seconds, which is quite good. Fantastic. So now what we want to do is we want it to start timing, and then we want to press a button again to stop it timing, and then we want to press a button again to start the second timer, then press a button to stop that. And last time we looked at this little bit of logic here, and we also looked at this little bit of logic here. So I'm going to need to adapt this a little bit. So you press a button once, and this is looking whether I'm pressing the button as we go around. You press a button once, it starts a timer. Press a button a second time, it stops the timer and leaves. And that is going to be slightly complicated, but nothing too much. So I'm going to change. Not sure if I can change this actually. I think I can. I can't change this. Let's see. I'm going to change timer active to timer state. Yes, it lets me do that. And you can see it's changed all the timer actives in this program to timer state. And I'm going to start with timer state equals 0. And I'm going to get it so when I press a button, then timer state becomes 1, and then 2. And that's going to help me to control where the timer is going to be. So this is a little bit of something called state control, which you do in some digital electronics and things like that, which is a whole topic in itself, but this is a very simple form. So when we say if a button is going to be pressed, so if it's not 255, so as long as we're pressing any button at all, I'm going to have decision in here. I'm going to say if timer state equals 0, and we press the button, timer state is going to become 1. So timer state equals 1. And if it's not 0, I want to do a very similar thing. I'm going to say if it equals 1, then it's going to become 2. So that's nice there. So if timer state's 1, it's going to be doing this timing thing. And that's fine. That's good. That's what we want. And if I press the button again, timer state's going to become 2. And instead of having this while 1 loop, so instead of going round and round and round, I'm going to say loop while timer state doesn't equal 2. So it'll set up the screen like you can see here with the zeros and first time and second time. It'll come into here. It'll go into the while loop and it'll keep looping around the while loop for now. And it'll come into this loop and it'll time a second every time, and I'll be able to press a button and it'll start off this timer. And because it'll make timer go to equal 1, and we'll just have a look at that working. So start off by pressing a button. You can see it starts counting. And if I press another button or press the button again, it stops. And because I've taken the while 1 loop out, when it stops, it leaves this big while loop here and it goes towards the end. So that's fine. Pretty happy with that. And what I want now is to copy this whole loop, and I'm going to do the same thing. So hold Control and drag while it's highlighted. I'm going to put it here. And I'm going to need to print it in a slightly different position. So instead of being at 0, 1, it's going to be at 0, 3. And I'm also going to need to reset some variables before getting into here. So we're going to want count to be 0 again. And we're going to want timer state to also equal 0. And that resets things. So now if I press play, and I don't have to press 1, we can press any of these buttons. So press the button there, you can see it's timing. Press the button again, and it stops. Press the button again, and the second timer starts. And then if I press the button again, the timer stops, and it exits the program. So it's not a super useful program, but you can see the basics of something which can be quite useful. And it looks quite long and messy. And this is part of the reason where, or part of the situation where we can have macros to really help us do what we want to do. So like I say, a macro is a way to have a whole chunk of code which we're going to use again and again and again. And yes, we could shrink this down so this whole while loop is collapsed, but macros make it a lot better. And we're going to start off with just a simple macro, which is a chunk of code which is all by itself with no inputs and no outputs. And to make a new macro, first of all, I'm going to add the macro in here, the call macro. There's other ways to do this. It's a bit like adding a variable. Double click on call macro, and I'm going to click add new, and I'm just going to call it counter. So I've got a macro that I want to call counter. We don't need any parameters or any return variables at the minute. We'll look at those in just a moment. So I've got this called counter. So this is a counter. So we've got the main program here, but we've also got this little one here. And what happens is when we get to this call macro, it's going to enter this macro, and this box here is pretty much this window. So at the begin, go in here, and if we put some blocks into the program itself here, the begin is what happens in here. So this is like the begin at the end, at the start, sorry. This is the begin at the start, and we've got the end at this bottom part here. So when it comes to end here, it's going to go back to the main program. It's going to come out this part here. And I want to include all of this code in my macro. And for now, that should be working. So, double click on the call macro because it hasn't actually been assigned yet. Click counter, and this is just going to do the counter program. And I can delete all of this. So, now instead of going and doing that big chunk of program, it's going to go into counter. It's going to go through this section here, and then it's going to come back out the other end. So we'll do it once at full speed, and just show that it's still working how we want it to. So it's counting the first one, stops, and then counts the second one. There we go. And then it stops again. I'm going to do this again, but this time I'm going to slow it down. So 5 Hertz is probably it's a bit fast. So we'll go to 2 Hertz. So you can see we're now in the counter aspect of the program. So we've went into, I'll tell you what, I'll stop it and start again. So we can see going through the initial setup here, you can see how it's going to print each section of the screen, one after another. And then we enter the macro. So you sort of enter the macro, and now we're in this macro section here. And if we press a button, then and we release it, we can see it goes and starts the counting section. So it's going to start counting up. Might need to speed that up a little bit so we can actually see it happen in real time. So we can see it going round and round and round. And there we go, it's starting to count up. It's went around 10 times now. That should be counting. Not sure why it's not. It was before when it was working at full speed. You can see it's working now. So I think that's just a little glitch in the programmer. So if I press the button again and we release, we can see it goes after going around the counter a few times. It'll I need to try that again. So it goes back into the main part of the program, and then at that point we can press a button and it'll go back to the bottom section here, so it'll start counting around the bottom section. I think there were some glitches there with the simulation, but that is fine. But we can see that it's working at full speed, so we're quite happy with all that. And the beauty of this is, instead of having this big chunk of program here, we can do it again. So we can take this section out and put in the counter, and I'm going to just hold Control and copy this. And the astute among you will know that we're going to have a slight issue with this, and that's going to lead us on to the next section. But see if you can figure out what the problem is going to be by just copying this code to here. So if I press play and we're running at full speed, I'm going to click to start the first timer. You can see that's working. If I click to start the second timer, what happens is it actually starts again at the first timer, and that's because we're not printing in the correct position. So what we can do is we can include in the macro, and actually you got access to your macros here. You can go and you can view it as a few different things. You can even show it as C code here, but we can edit it. And I want to add a parameter. I'll call this parameter y pos for the y position. And this is just like a parameter in a normal macro. So if we go back to one of the macros from before, one of these will do fine. The cursor macro has two parameters, x and y. And now our counter has this y pos. And this one is going to be 1. And this one I'm going to put at 3. So these are like inputs. These are we've seen them when we did the component macros in the past. So they're a bit like inputs, and we're going to have to use that. So if we come to this part of the program, and we'll look at local variables. So local variables only exist in this part of the program. The type of variables we've been using so far are global variables, but we're going to be looking at local variables. So we've got y pos here. And instead of the y coordinate I'm going to have here, I'm going to include y pos. And if we do it not normally, so y pos, it doesn't work. It won't recognize it. And that's because if you're using a local variable, you need to have this dot in front. And it's just the way that Flowcode handles local variables. You just need to use a dot in front of this. And this means that whatever we put in, it's going to print in that position. So when we press play, and we can see it now should work. So we press the button to start it. It's counting, nice and happy. And then we'll press the button to count the next time, and you can see it's working down here as well. And if we wanted to, we could put it in a completely different part. So we could put it on to change to 0. And the second timer, instead of timing down here, should time on top of this first timer here. So we'll have a look at that. So press it the first time, And you can see it's going counting there, and then if I press the counter another time, it starts counting at the top here. So that's working how we expected. That's fantastic. Changes back to where I want it to be though, because it's a nice neat program when it works. Okay, so we've looked at inputs. We've got one more thing to look at with these macros, and I'm going to look at what we'll call the return variable. Don't need to add a new one. I want to edit this one. So we're going to have a return variable. We're going to have a byte, and that means that it's a bit like where we have, I think they've all moved into this section now, where we're looking at the button here, and we've got a return variable at the bottom, and this is where, like an output. So in this button one, we don't have any inputs, but it looks to see the, I suppose, the input from the outside influence, and it puts that as an output. And we could have something which would do a calculation. So you could have some made up macro which will add two numbers together, for example. So you have two inputs, you would have two parameters, the two numbers that you're adding together, and you have an output which is a sum. What we're going to do this time is we're just going to look at the button that we're pressing on the output. So I'm going to want my global variables, and we'll use button. Why not? We'll use button because we're not using it this part. It might not be the best way to use the program, but you can see now the return variable is available. And I'm going to put in a little bit of code. So I'm going to want, we'll use this bit of code here. I'm going to put it after this section. And I'm going to print around here. So that's going to be about 10, 1. And I'm just going to print the number. This is just to show how this works. And I'm going to press button. So we're going to print the button that we're going to be looking at. So in the macro, we've got button equals counter 1 here. So this is still going to be doing counter 1. It's not going to do anything, but all that we're going to do when we're coming to here is I'm going to change this to my local return variable. So instead of using button in the program here, we're going to use return. And whenever we use that elsewhere, we're going to use it here. Instead of button, we are going to use return. And that is a local variable, so we need dot. So you can either type it in or go through this menu here. And now, what it should allow us to do, fingers crossed. So we press the button 1 to go into the timer. And I'm going to press button 5. I don't believe it's going to come out with a 5 just before it does the wrong number. I think it might come out with a 4 when I press this because of how we look at the numbers on here. It came out as 255. That's probably because of the way that the counter is working. And actually when it looked at this point here. So it'll go around and it'll go around this a few more times. So what I could do just to make sure that it's working if I want to, so I could do a little bit of debugging, a little bit of bonus content here, is just before the end, I'm going to say dot return equals 6. And just to make sure that we are returning the value that we want, we'll try it again. So we'll start the program. And then we will, well, before I stop it, what I will say is I am hoping to put a lot more content out. Thank you for everybody who subscribed recently because it has inspired me to make some more videos on the channel. And I'm actually going to do a bit more stuff on Flowcode, a bit more stuff on programming, things like this. But I might also stray into some maths content and put some maths tutorials up as well as some maths worksheets. If you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments. The subscriptions to the video and liking it are also massively appreciated. And just let me know what kind of content you'd like to see because I am more than happy to put out some education content. But I won't hold you in bated breath very much longer. If we press the button here, then we can see it comes out with a 6 here, and then we can go back into doing the timing like we were earlier. So thank you for watching. Hope that you found that informative. It's quite a good way of showing how these macros work. If you have any questions, do feel free to ask them in the comments. More than happy to see if we can sort you out with the problems that you're having, and I hope to see you again when I release my next video. Bye.